All right, we are going to go ahead and get started here. It looks like we have several new people today. Lori, I think you might be the only one from last week. But if you did not get to tune in last week, my name is Lindsay Northup, and I am currently getting my master's in social work at the University of Kansas here in the Kansas City area. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a review kind of from last week. Last week, our theme was understanding trauma. And we talked about that the kids that are entering your homes are probably going to have experienced a lot of different types of trauma, lots of different types of stress, lots of different types of adversity. And so some traumas might be a little bit less obvious than others. Often kids entering care experience more than one adversity. So a child might be experiencing physical or sexual abuse, coupled with repeated foster care placements, early neglect, things like that. So they can kind of layer on top of each other sometimes. And we also discussed very briefly that for children and youth of color who identify as LGBTQ, trauma tends to be even more common and complex. We discussed that the experience of trauma, stress, and adversity strongly affects lots of different aspects of children's and teens' developments. We talked about how trauma affects kids, how kids take in information and the ways that they really understand themselves and kind of make an image for themselves, as well as how they understand other people in relationships and how they make meaning of their experiences. And then finally, we wrapped up by talking about how all of us, child or not, develop strategies to help us adapt to our world. And that many of the behaviors that we see in children and teens who experience trauma are survival strategies. So that's just a brief little review of last week for you guys who are not with us. And we will start in on today's theme. So today's theme is behavior makes sense. And we're going to focus on understanding that the behavior of children and teens in your home, it happens for a reason. And so the behavior of kids who've experienced trauma can be really challenging, confusing, but it's really important for us to remember that we do things for a reason, and that, like I said, behavior makes sense. So first, we're going to start off with a question. If you guys are new, participation is always encouraged, but not required at all. So if you would like to participate, that would be great. If not, that's okay. So, but just to kind of start off the day, what behaviors do you guys see in the children and teens in your home that have been challenging? What kind of behaviors really push your buttons with the kiddos that are currently in your home?
I have 2-year-old twins, and we're going through temper tantrums right now. That's my problem.
Oh, fun. The terrible twos.
Indeed. It's so much fun.
Oh, I'm sure. Twins. That's double deal.
Exactly. And they're just the fighting, the bickering between the two of them.
Yes. Being siblings and that close in age, for sure. Yeah, so that would definitely be a behavior that pushes buttons. That makes sense. Anyone else have any examples?
I have an almost 11-year-old son who screams that I'm a piece of crap and tells me I'm stupid on a regular basis.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be frustrating. Very frustrating for sure. Anyone else? Okay, good examples. Definitely makes sense. So, have to remember to do my PowerPoint. I always forget. So the challenge of behavior. Kids who have experienced trauma have a lot of challenging behaviors that are really confusing sometimes and hard to manage, and may lead to really strong emotional reactions in their caregivers and us, as you can imagine. So when we don't understand where the behavior comes from, it's easier to get caught up in your own emotional responses. And so in today's group, we're going to be focusing on understanding what might be underneath some of those behaviors that you guys observe in your homes. And so in our next session, next week, we're going to talk more about how to understand and support your own reactions to this type of behavior. But today we're going to focus on kind of the underlying reasons. So where does behavior come from? So think of one thing that you guys could feel like you could do in your sleep. Whether that's, oh gosh, I want to say I feel like I could drive in my sleep, but that probably wouldn't work very well. But, whatever it is, why does it feel so easy? It feels so easy because you've probably done it a million times. And so all of us develop strategies for managing the world around us. I'm blocking myself out. Kind of guided in part by our previous experiences. And so that's how we learn how to manage our current world. So let's think back to Olivia. If you weren't called in last week, Olivia is a character that these trainings kind of utilize throughout all the sessions that we're going to kind of return back to. So Olivia, like all the kids who's affected by trauma, Olivia has learned behaviors based on repeated experiences of danger. And these behaviors may appear to make less sense now that she's out of the situation. But originally, they were ways to take care of herself. So if you weren't here last week, Olivia is a child who is going between foster care homes. She has experienced neglect. She watched one of her parents be arrested in front of her. Her parents used drugs. And so now she's kind of theoretically in these foster care homes and is having some remaining behavior issues as she is adjusting. So it says, when Olivia was living with her biological parents, her house was unpredictable. Sometimes there was a lot of screaming and violence and things felt very scary. In those moments, Olivia learned to stay very still or to hide. If no one saw her, she felt like she was safer. So the situation that Olivia was repeatedly exposed to was the screaming and violence. And the behaviors that she developed or learned was the stillness and hiding. So let's keep that in mind. It says that at other times, when Olivia's mom was using drugs, she might be affectionate or loving, even if her behaviors didn't always make sense. Olivia had to work hard to get her mother's attention because her mom would seem spacey or talk to herself. If Olivia climbed on her mother, hugged her, or cried loudly, her mother would sometimes give her a hug or rock her. So in this situation, Olivia was repeatedly exposed to kind of confusing behavior by her caregiver, a lack of attention, and she learned that attention has to be earned by either, crying, climbing on her caregiver, things like that. So notice how in this specific instance, Olivia's learned behavior is very different from the last instance. So stillness, hiding versus being really overly kind of in her mom's business. So to understand Olivia and to understand trauma-related behavior, it's important to understand 3 different factors that we're going to discuss today. The lens that the child or teen is using to understand the world, the need the child or teen is trying to meet with their behavior, and the child or teen's ability to recover. So those are the 3 aspects we're going to talk about today. So starting off with the lens. None of us see the world in exactly the same way. We all interpret information slightly differently based on our lens. And the ways that we interpret the world are based largely on our experiences on what we have been taught. One of the strongest teachers is danger. We kind of talked about that last week. And when we've experienced something dangerous, we learn to quickly associate things related to that experience with danger. So here it just says, if you guys are following along on the slideshow, all of us are influenced by our experiences. Over time, our experiences affect how we see and understand everything around us and shape our filter or lens for understanding what is safe and what is dangerous. And then there's a quote, a Spanish proverb here that says, experience is not always the kindest of teachers, but it is surely the best. So if you look at the list on the slide, if you can see it, thinking about your own filters, think about the meaning that you might make of raised voices, of someone not looking you in the eye, the meaning that you make of someone who's quiet, the meaning you might make of the smell of fire, a hand on your shoulder, the sound of crying, people in authority. So any of these examples that you've heard, which of these might elicit a positive response for you? Does anyone have any that might elicit a positive response? If you can't see the slide, it's quite the list. So If not, that's okay. So maybe a hand on your shoulder. Maybe that's comforting to some of you. Maybe physical touch is your love language and that can comfort you. Maybe people in authority make you feel safe and protected. And then some of the other examples, they might make you more nervous, like the smell of fire. That could indicate danger. Raised voices, some of you might not like yelling. The example that they have here is that some people might assume that raised voices mean conflict, or some people might think that raised voices means that the speaker is happy and, just noisy and part of a happy, loud, boisterous family. So think about which of these things might be associated with higher energy in your own body and what kind of things lead to really strong reactions for you. So moving on to triggers. And this is going to be a review for a lot of you guys. We're still kind of getting into the meat of the whole training. So I'm sure you guys know these things, but we know that triggers are signals or clues kind of about the world that have been learned as a result of previous experiences of danger. And so these signals or clues help us to mobilize pretty rapidly when there's danger. And the rapid mobilization is a way that our brain has learned to keep us safe. So kind of like that information highway that we talked about last week. And the more frequently that someone has experienced danger, the more rapidly that these clues will lead to a survival response. And once our brain has learned to read and react to the signals, we might mobilize even in absence of actual danger. So all back to that information highway. And it's important to remember that even things like current events and, things that kids might see on TV or in the news or read online, those different things can be triggers, particularly for kiddos of color or who I do identify as LGBTQ. So here's this lovely graphic that we talked about last week. If you guys are online, you can see it. But in our last session, we discussed the express road. So the idea that signals of possible danger will put kids' brains on an express road to action. We kind of bypass all of that processing, evaluating our options, planning before we act. We bypass all of this, we observe, and then we act. So the more danger a child or teen has experienced, the more likely it is that they have lots of different things in the world that they could interpret as dangerous. So based on your guys' experiences with kiddos in your own homes, what kind of things do you imagine or know might be triggers or signals of danger for your kiddos?
Raised voices.
Raised voices. Yeah, that's pretty common.
Alcohol being present.
Okay, yes. Alcohol. Anything else that you guys can think of?
My kids are sensitive to certain scents also. There's some scents that trigger them or cause them to remember things that were unpleasant in their past.
Yes. And that's one I feel like we can forget about a lot of times. We kind of discussed that last week, that all five senses can really be triggers. So it's a good one. I know that last time I taught this course, one woman talked about eye contact was a trigger for the kiddos in her home. Being looked in the eyes for the child felt like a challenge to the child, and they feared eye contact. But good examples. Elise, can you still not see my screen?
Yeah, no, I can't. It's just totally white.
Here, let me reshare for you. Give me 1
Okay.
second.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yep, I got it now.
Okay, you guys both have it? See on? Okay, perfect. Awesome. So, good examples. So, here's just a list of examples of common triggers that we might not have talked about. Lack of power or control, unexpected change, routine changes. I've talked about a lot with parents. Physical closeness or contact, whether that's too much contact or too little contact. Sensory input, like we talked about, smell, sight, things like that. Feeling shame. Positive attention can be a trigger. Last week we discussed how how it can be confusing when kiddos are in a new, safe, loving home, how they can still struggle with behavioral issues, and how sometimes part of that can be because they fear forming those close, meaningful relationships because they fear that they might lose them and that they might not be permanent relationships. Other common triggers: feeling rejection, rejected or abandoned, direct reminders of specific events, kind of like maybe the presence of alcohol that we were talking about, things like this. You guys gave me yours, so we can skip that. So, thinking back to what we know about Olivia's story, what kinds of things do you think might act as triggers or signals of danger for her? You guys can think back to her story. I think only 2 of you got to hear the whole big spiel last week, but if you think back to it, we talked about the raised voices that she experienced in her home. Maybe even since her parent got arrested in front of her, maybe, you know, the authorities, maybe police officers scare her, things like that.
Alcohol also, I think, was the factor.
Yes, alcohol, drugs. It talked about that she was neglected, so maybe her house was in a state of disrepair, so maybe certain scents, things like that. So, got to keep up with my slides. Oh, here's the answers for us. Being yelled at, being ignored, not having needs met, feeling frightened, loud noises, angry voices, things like that. So, on to our main topic. Behavior addresses a need. So, most behavior serves some function. If you think about your own behaviors and why you engage in them. So, just think about how you guys act as parents and why you act the way that you do. You might, oh gosh, I don't know. You might kind of walk back and forth, pace when you're worried to kind of manage your stress. You might, when you go somewhere new, if you're taking a new class with different parents, if you're in a new unfamiliar situation, you might kind of hang back a little bit, maybe look for people that you know. When you're nervous, you might kind of withdraw if someone hurts your feelings, things like that. So we all have behaviors that kind of arise to protect us and get our needs met. And when these behaviors come from repeated experience of danger or significant neglect experiences, they might be really rigid or seem kind of undesirable. But just like with our own behaviors as adults, we learn these behaviors because they serve some sort of function. And so because of their histories of violence or abuse or loss or neglect, separation, whatever it may be, the 2 major functions of behavior that we see in children in care are behaviors that keep them safe, so safety behaviors, and behaviors that are designed to help kiddos get their needs met. So those are 2 primary functions of behaviors for some of these kiddos that we might be interacting with. They have a quote here about responding to stress by Michael D. Bellis. It says, while there are infinite numbers of stressors that can cause a subjective sense of overwhelming stress and distress in a child, there are a finite number of ways that the brain and the body can respond to those stressors. So moving on to safety options, our responses. So there's lots of things that might stress us out, but there's only a couple ways that we can react. And one of the primary functions of trauma-related behavior is to keep us safe. And so many different things that we might feel as dangerous, many things that the children we work with that they might feel as dangerous, we might not feel as dangerous. We talked about that last week. But once someone feels that they're in danger, there's only going to be a couple of behavioral options available. So we can either fight, flight, freeze, or submit. So flight is an aggressive response to attack or ward off the danger. Flight is a withdrawal response to escape the danger. Freeze is a high energy, it's high energy even though you're becoming still, which is an attempt to kind of remain unseen or unnoticed. So usually freeze happens when neither fight or flight is available. And then submit or comply, an attempt to accommodate the perceived source of danger. So for you guys with your kiddos, is one of these most prominent in their behavior? Do you see your kids reacting in the same kind of way, either fight, flight, freeze, or submission? Any of those seem most common for you guys?
Fight, always fight.
Yeah,
Always
fight for my
fight.
kids too. Fight's always my kids.
Okay.
I get both.
Both fight and flight, and
Yeah, it
you
depends.
get
on
all of them, just combination. I don't hear any of you guys saying submit. But fight or flight, that seems common. I've worked with a lot of, I used to work in a crisis nursery, and a lot of our teenagers, it would be the flight or freeze, the withdraw or just walk away. They won't even engage with you. I personally haven't experienced a lot of submission or just compliance, but some of you might have. And then fighting, I feel like that's the one that all of us probably have a lot of experience with. So, and then it just says here, flight might look like a child sitting in their room, not making eye contact, wearing headphones. Fight may look like high energy or impulsive behavior. We all know what fighting looks like. So these different strategies, all four of them, they all actually require energy. And when our brain perceives danger, energy is released into our body. And the more chronic the danger responses have been, the higher the likelihood that the starting baseline energy for a child will be really high, so that the child's body's kind of in this chronic, constant state of readiness. So we have this illustration here, if you can see it on the slide, about a car. So repeated danger responses lead children to experience chronic hyperarousal, high levels of energy in their bodies. So if you imagine that you're driving a car, and that your engine is revving, your brakes aren't working, your foot's falling asleep, we can imagine that this is kind of what it's like to live with chronic danger in our body. So chronic revving of the motor, that's that high baseline level of energy. Not being able to brake or not being able to slow down is that difficulty stopping the energy, difficulty managing the pedals or your foot's asleep. We can kind of think of as those rapid shifts in energy level that seem kind of disconnected from the situation. And then what if we run out of gas? So some kids experience the chronic hyperarousal, and this may become so overwhelming that over time they kind of learn how to shut it off and kind of numb those feelings and emotions. And so these kids might seem really disconnected or shut down, or they might appear to be doing fine, but suddenly they explode when the disconnection becomes too challenging for them. They're out of gas, they're done, and they explode. So what do children and teens need beyond just physical safety? Kids obviously need to make sure that they're safe. They also need to make sure that their basic needs, whether that's, food, shelter, developmental needs of learning, connection, relationship, they also need to make sure those kind of needs are met. And so often these children's needs haven't really been met by the adults in their lives, kind of in the past, and they may have experienced chronic neglect or physical, relational, emotional losses, some combination of all of those things. And so as a result, kids may adapt their behavior to getting their needs met. Just like the survival-oriented behaviors, the needs-focused behaviors can be really difficult to change, and they might persist even when a child is in a situation where their needs are now being met, where they're safe, where they're loved and taken care of. So if we look here on the list in the PowerPoint, who has ever heard or used these words to describe a child or teen in your home? manipulates, hoards, steals, clingy, lies, needy, dependent. I'm sure that you guys have heard the kiddos in your homes describe this that way. I've heard them described that way in my experience. So if we think about these behaviors, they might seem undesirable on the surface. Fighting is not going to be desirable. Running away isn't always desirable. But it's important that we understand why these types of behaviors are occurring. And so if you've used words like this or have heard them used to describe kiddos in your home, try to think about the behavior from the child's perspective. Why you might think that this child or teen engaged in those different kinds of behaviors. So if we look at this and we kind of translate some of these, reframing the function of these different behaviors that can be really seen as undesirable can help us to be more empathetic to these types of behaviors, even when they feel really challenging. So manipulation, that might be a child who has learned to get his or her needs met. A hoarding child might keep items in case everything else disappears. I've worked with a lot of kiddos who kind of have that food insecurity. And so even when they're in a safe place and they know that they're going to be fed, they still, we find snacks and things like that, like under their bed, because they're afraid that that's going to be taken from them. A child who steals might just be trying to make sure that they get what they need or what they want. A clingy child might be trying really hard to make an adult pay attention to them, kind of like that Olivia example when she's climbing all over her mom. She just needs attention. So we kind of have to work on reframing these kind of undesirable behaviors and really trying to focus on the root of those behaviors and what need is trying to be met. So let's think about how all of this might apply to Olivia in her attempts to kind of meet those survival needs. So if we look at Olivia, it says that Olivia pays a lot of attention to the emotions and behaviors of people around her and changes her own behavior in response. She might freeze, hide, or get very silent when she hears loud noises. She clings, acts needy, or has very big emotional displays when someone seems distracted. So, I'm supposed to ask you guys. So why do we think that she acts like this? We're paying a lot of attention to emotions. That's because in her house, there was a lot of instability. Sometimes her parents would be loving, meet her needs. Sometimes they'd come in and be really angry. So that's why she's constantly aware of the emotions of the adults around her. We already talked about her freezing and hiding responses, and then the clinging to get attention. So another aspect that we're talking about today is the ability to recover. For most of us, really intense feelings are kind of followed by these attempts to manage those feelings. We try to use our internal resources, so like our different coping strategies that we might have, as well as our external resources, our support system, to kind of manage these feelings. And this requires us to recognize that we're upset. It also requires us to recognize or believe that we can manage our experience. And we also have to have resources and be motivated to use them. And so children who have been affected by trauma often lack both the internal resources and those external resources. So can't really manage hard feelings super well, might feel like they can't trust or rely on other people. And so as a result, many children who have experienced chronic trauma might get stuck in that kind of high intensity feeling, and their ability to recover is really impaired, and it's hard for them to move on. Some other examples that we have here on this slide, internal, external resources, frustration tolerance, biological vulnerabilities, ability to read other people, social connection and support, affect management, trust, problem solving. And so a lot of the kiddos that we might work with and interact with might not have a lot of these resources. So to respond successfully and effectively to trauma-related behavior, you first have to understand where these behaviors are coming from. So this includes being curious about the trigger, what led to the behavior, what might my child or teen have been reacting to, the need, what is the function of the child or teen's current behavior, what might they need, what might they be trying to tell me. your immediate response. How can you ensure safety in this situation? How can you keep the child safe? How can you keep yourself safe? And then your regulation strategy. How can you help a child or teen return to a kind of a more regulated, calm state? How do you help them regain a sense of safety or control? So in some of our future sessions, we're going to talk more about a lot of different tools and skills that you can use to support yourself when responding to trauma-related behaviors, as well as ways to respond and to support the kiddos and teens in your home. But that's for a different session. So we are already to the wrap-up. We were really short today. If you guys weren't here last week, these sessions are actually meant to be taught in person for little 2-hour chunks. And so because we're doing them online, we've kind of had to edit them, and we've had to take out a lot of the activities sometimes. So today was really activity heavy. I apologize, but you guys will still get your 1-hour credit. So to wrap up, behavior makes sense and is often an attempt to meet a need. To understand the behavior of your child or teen, we have to remember the lens. We have to remember that their perception is reality, regardless of whether or not we perceive things the same way, regardless of whether or not we perceive things as dangerous or not. Perception is reality for the child. We need to remember that behavior addresses a need. Survival is going to trump everything. So some of those, undesirable behaviors, the manipulation, the lying, we have to remember that these kiddos have been trained and have learned to solely meet survival needs. And if a child or teen is struggling to recover, ask yourself, what are his or her resources? What do they have in place already? How can we build those? And like I said, we're going to talk about that some more. And then to address challenging behavior, cultivate your curiosity. Ask why. Go through those different steps of, what's the trigger? What's the need that's trying to be met? Regulate your immediate responses and try to help the child regain safety and security. So, self-reflection piece for this week. If you guys are new, this is not required. It's just a little recommended thing. So, if you take some time this week to reflect on an incident that maybe has already occurred, that is going to occur this week with a child in your home, or with someone at your job, someone in your family, whatever. But take some time to reflect on an incident where you became frustrated or angry, and try to think of something that's kind of moderately, it makes you moderately angry, and try to apply those different steps that we talked about: the identifying the trigger, identifying the meaning that you've applied to the situation, identifying your behavioral response, and identify your own recovery pathway. Kind of try to track yourself in that response. So remember the lens, remember that your behavior addresses the need, and remember that everyone has different abilities to recover. So we can skip this because it's the same thing. Did I fall back on my PowerPoint? And then they just encourage you, sorry guys, my papers are all messed up. They encourage you at home this week to tune into one of those behaviors with your kiddos that elicits kind of a mild, they want it to be mild, negative response, an annoyance. Whether it's those temper tantrums, whether it's, being yelled at. Try to tune into one of those behaviors and pay attention to the pattern. When does it happen? What leads to the behavior, and what function might it serve? So maybe some of us might get yelled at, after a really hard day at school. School didn't go well, and that's when we end up getting yelled at. Some of you might not be able to identify a pattern, but try to if you can. And then our next session is going to be Monday, May 20th at noon. Again, I apologize for the shortness of the session today. If you guys could please make sure to fill out those evaluation forms that were emailed to you by Sarah Eck. That's how you're going to get credit. And let me make sure that I have all of you: Angela, Aubrey, Elise, Laurie, Leah, Cyan. If there's anyone that I missed, please type your name into the chat box. Let me know.
I did that last week, and then I just checked with her this morning. I haven't received my certificate yet for last week's class.
Okay, Elise, you haven't received it? I'll email Sarah about that for you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, you guys. See you next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.